All right, hello and welcome to the final webinar in the AAPEX webinar series. My name is Kelly Dunman and I'm with AAPEX Event Management. Before diving in, I would like to remind all attendees that your mics will be muted for the duration of this webinar. We will not have time for questions at the end of today's presentation, but should you have any, you are more than welcome to use the question function within your chat and we'll reach out to you after this webinar. In addition, I'd like to remind everybody that this webinar will be recorded and hosted on apexshow.com at a later date. Today's presentation will be Aftermarket Outlook 2021. So without further ado, I would like to introduce NPD's Executive Director and Industry Analyst, Nathan Shipley. Nathan, take it away.
All right, Kelly. Well, thank you for the introduction, and hello, everybody. Thank you for attending our session today. I think we have a little over an hour worth of content, maybe right at an hour of content to share with you. So we're excited to have this presentation. I am very accustomed to being in Las Vegas, like all of us typically are right now this time of year, maybe standing on a stage in front of you, but instead we do it here from my home office in Houston, Texas. So with that said, let's get into what we're seeing out there with retail overall and what's happening from an aftermarket perspective. It has been a fascinating year, to say the least, for all of us. So let's talk about what we're seeing. We have a broad audience that attends this session, so there's a number of folks that don't know who NPD is and what we do as a company. We are a privately held market research and consulting firm that's based up in the New York area. We track what's happening at retail in over 20 industries. So we have a number of data assets at our disposal to really understand what's happening with consumers and what's happening with retail, whether that's point of sale data from close to 300,000 individual stores that we collect data from often on a weekly basis. We track receipts from consumers to know what they're buying, where they're buying, how much they're spending, et cetera. We have a number of consumer data assets through surveys that we field. Some are weekly, some are monthly, et cetera. And we work with literally thousands of companies around the world on the manufacturing and the retail side and the distributor side especially as well, to help them understand what's going on and why. The industries that we track, automotive is near and dear to my heart, but we're tracking over 21 industries. So when I talk to you about at a high level what's happening with retail, the industries that we're looking at are listed in front of you, and we're capturing a wide swath of what's happening out there in retail, from electronics to automotive, apparel, cosmetics, toys, sports, and some of these industries have really come into the spotlight here in the last few months as we have all been more at home, maybe playing sports in the backyard, maybe riding a bike for the first time in a while, maybe doing a project in the garage on a car, which I will talk quite a bit about as we get into this. So the scope of this presentation today, it's fairly broad, and I'm actually excited to share this with you because I typically come to AAPEX thinking about what's really happened at a high level with both retail and in the aftermarket, and then what's to come. And there's some macro things we usually talk about, but I don't think any of us a year ago at AAPEX were thinking about a pandemic. And when the pandemic really started, if you think back this year, February and March timeframe, I frankly was concerned about the aftermarket, as you know, common sense said, look, cars are going to come to us, cars aren't going to be driving. That's going to have, a negative effect on the industry. And in some regards it did, but in other regards it actually was a steroid shot for reasons that frankly a lot of us probably wouldn't have expected as to why. So we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to tell you what's happening at a high level with retail. We're going to talk about consumer sentiment as it relates to COVID today. And when I'm talking about today, what are people thinking about right now? Not what they were thinking about 3, 4, 5 months ago. And that is definitely a moving target, but we're going to talk about what they're thinking about right now, especially as we go into the colder months. Kelly and I were talking before this. She's in Chicago, and it sounds like it's very cold and possibly going to be snowing up there in that part of the country. So that's what's going on up there. E-commerce and what's happened in that regard, that has definitely seen a steroid shot as a lot of consumers, old, young, folks that maybe hadn't shopped online before, now all of a sudden are shopping online because they don't want to go into a store. Discretionary spending has been literally off the charts. I'll talk quite a bit about that, and that will lead us to what's happening in the aftermarket today and where we think this is going to go over the short term. It is challenging in a normal year to forecast what we think might happen in the coming 12 months. Our industry has a lot of things that are not controllable, the weather obviously being an important one of those things that we cannot control. But now we have a pandemic at our hands, and things like working from home versus driving to an office, what back to school looks like. And even though everyone thinks of back to school as August and back to school is behind us, it's really not, because back to school is a moving target still to this day as school districts all over the country adopt to challenges that they're facing this week compared to the week before, compared to the week prior to that. So things are changing, things are moving target. So let's talk about the retail environment at a very high level. So our company 6 months ago said, hey, let's try to map out what the business phases of COVID-19 might look like. You had the realization back in March or April, hey, this is a real thing, right? Let's go stock up on toilet paper, which was a thing. Then you had reality, and for most of retail, the reality was that stores were closed. For our industry, it was deemed essential. And so a lot of our stores remained open. But the challenge for us is a lot of cars sat idle, whether that was the daily driver, whether that was the local Uber or Lyft driver, a taxi driver, a bus, whatever it might be, transportation came to a screeching halt. So miles driven, we saw dropped off fairly significantly. Then we get into a restart and a recovery phase. And I think we are somewhere in between those two. I don't think we could call this a recovery. But I think things have started turning back the other way, especially for the aftermarket. When you start looking at things like just simply the miles driven numbers, they are not what they were. We're not seeing declines of 30, 40, 50% like we saw back in April, right? We saw the big dip, and it's slowly trying to come back. And it's been somewhat stable now for the last few weeks, and I'll get into that. But call that a restart, if you will. Recovery and reemergence, though, those are two things. Is it ever going to be back to business as usual? I told myself to not say this, but I'm going to say it anyways. What does the new normal look like? I don't think any of us know what back to business as usual actually looks like in a year, 2, 3 years from now. Things will be different, some positive, some negative, but we're not there yet. Give it time and we will definitely get there. So what does COVID look like today for consumers that we're talking to? And this is in the middle of October. We're doing ongoing survey work. We're doing a lot of work kind of thinking ahead, what we're calling the future of our industry, future of other industries that our company tracks. And so when we think about just a week or two ago, 53% of consumers were telling us, look, there's really no impact right now to my employment status. The flip side of that is 47% of those folks are saying, yes, there has been some impact. Most of the impact is negative. There are some people that are reporting, look, I'm working more now than ever. There's more work, there are construction jobs, et cetera. I'm just very busy. But overall, 53% saying no impact today. Over half still practicing some sort of social distancing. And the challenge with these numbers is it's very easy for each of us as individuals to think about what's happening in our own little bubble and taking that as what's happening everywhere. And the reality is that it's not. Every part of the country is different in terms of what's happening with social distancing, what's happening with masks, what's happening with in-store traffic, et cetera. So here in Houston, things have calmed down, if you will. The COVID rates are fairly low, and so it's a little easier to get out and say, all right, maybe things are kind of returning to normal, which really isn't the case. Over half the country is still doing some sort of social distancing. And I say all these things to keep in mind how this is impacting driving, right? The drive to the grocery store, the drive to the office, all of these things are impacting that drive. Even in a post-lockdown environment, 41% of consumers are still telling us as of 2 weeks ago or as of 10 days ago, look, I am not back to my shopping behavior, my shopping habits that I was exhibiting prior to COVID. And so that, again, is impacting us in the automotive aftermarket. On the retail side, it's impacting if you want to shop out there in the industry. It's definitely still impacting us, even though the numbers and what we're seeing look decent. And the miles driven numbers are, again, as I mentioned earlier, not down nearly what they were a few months ago. And I look ahead to the holiday shopping, and 64% of people are saying, look, I'm planning the same. And a lot of those folks are saying actually more shopping this holiday season. And the automotive aftermarket has never really been a seasonal industry in terms of shopping behavior. This is not apparel where we see a big spike in sales going into the holiday season, or office supplies that sees a big spike around back to school. we don't really think about the aftermarket as a gift-giving industry or where people shop for their loved ones as it relates to gifts. But I do think there's an opportunity here for our industry because so many people have picked up new hobbies in the garage over the last several months. I think this is a big opportunity, especially as family members say, look, I haven't seen my son in 6 months. We've kind of stayed distanced, and so maybe I'm going to spend more this go around just because I feel bad for not seeing him. So that's where we're at, thinking it at a very high level with COVID. So what does that translate to in terms of sales? So this is an aggregate of 12 or so industries that we're tracking. It's all based on really early data, and I don't want to get methodology too much, but a lot of our industries that report on some sort of a lag. But these numbers are through 10/17. And so the blue line is dollars, the green line is units. The automotive aftermarket, the retail side of the aftermarket that we track is in these numbers, in addition to a lot of other industries that everybody tracks. And so you have the big dip there in March. That's when COVID really became real. Then you have April and May, and that seems so long ago now, but if you'll recall, in late April was when the first round of stimulus checks really started hitting for a lot of households. And so that brought retail back up to flat, if not positive, which was a bit of a surprise. A lot of us in the analyst community didn't really have an idea how consumers might react to a stimulus. A lot of folks, it was to literally pay the light bill. But then for a lot of consumers, it was, hey, I now have an extra $1,200 in my pocket. I'm going to go do that project on the vehicle that I've been wanting to do. And now I have an excuse to do it because I have some extra money. And by the way, I have time on my hands because I'm driving to work every single day. So things slowly improve. Then you have Father's Day in June. Again, a big gift-giving time frame. But even compared to a year ago, it was a lot bigger gift-giving time frame. Again, we're all locked down. I haven't seen, so my father, my grandfather, my son, whoever it might be on Father's Day. And so we see a big spike in sales for retail. Mother's Day was in there as well in that time frame. Then things slowed down a little bit. The dip there in July was around Amazon Prime Day last year. On the far right-hand side of this chart, it's Amazon Prime Day this year, which was the 13th and 14th of this year, if I recall correctly. And that particular week was up 21%. And so, Amazon Prime Day it's actually days, it's 2 days. It's not just about Amazon anymore. Other retailers are definitely pushing their own deals during those couple of days. And so as a consumer, it was fascinating to go on Amazon Prime, do some shopping, and then price shop that around and see, wow, I can actually get the same deal or maybe even a better deal somewhere else. But all that to say, that was a significant increase in sales. That particular week was up 21%. But overall, things are trending generally positive for retail. That story does not hold true across the country. And so you've got different parts of the country. Now, this is going back a month ago, but it kind of gets the point across. There are different parts of the country that are up and some that are down. You have wildfires on the West Coast that are still, my understanding, they're still going on, that are really impacting sales. You have some states up in the Northeast. Look at New York in the middle of September was down 8%, Florida down 8%. But then kind of through the middle of the country, things are up. In certain states, they're up more. So it really depends on what's happening with COVID, what's happening with weather, what's happening with events, whether that be wildfires on the West Coast. Another thing I should mention, Florida is hurricanes, not necessarily hurricanes that were taking place this year, but hurricanes that took place a year ago that maybe spiked sales in certain categories as consumers prepared, and then brought them down this year. But a lot of varying performance throughout the country. The story for retail, though, has really been more about what's happening online than what's been happening in brick and mortar. So these three lines, the dark blue line on top is online, the light blue line on the bottom is in store, and green is overall total. Now, I'm looking at two different universes, so I just kind of showed you, hey, overall retail is generally up. If we take a step back, that slide was on a subset of industries. This is more broad. And don't try to compare the numbers directly. The takeaway here is e-commerce is what's really driving a lot of the growth in the industries that we track. So you had the Prime Day dip back in July. I don't have more current numbers to show you the Prime Day spike here as of 10 days ago or so. But e-commerce really is the story here. And in fact, we see e-commerce hovering in the plus 20% range. And again, this is an aggregate. And so when you break down some of the retailers that report publicly what's happening with their businesses online versus in store, you've got general merchandise retailers, you've got home improvement retailers, some apparel retailers, et cetera, that say, look, my revenue is X on the left, but look at my growth. Green being in store, the dark blue being online. Ace Hardware online being up almost 500% in their second quarter. Walmart up almost 100%. Best Buy up 240. These numbers illustrate the success that retailers are finding if they have the platform to support it. And most of these retailers did going into this thing. Some did not, and I don't have those on this chart. But where the infrastructure, the supply chain was in place, it's impressive to see the growth. And a lot of this is tied to DIY projects, both, again, in the home and in the garage. But e-commerce has been the story. There were a lot of consumers, especially older consumers, that had never shopped online pre-pandemic. They would go to the grocery store, they would go to the local retail stores that they're used to going to. But now all of a sudden, they are considered a high-risk population. So now they're the ones that are least likely to be going out. And all of a sudden, you know what? I actually have time. Maybe it's time that I actually learn how to do this thing called online shopping. So maybe they go and order groceries online. Maybe they go and actually order product online. And all of a sudden, 2 days later, there's something sitting on their doorstep. And wow, this actually is somewhat convenient. And so now you have to think about that type of forced change that has happened across the consumer base. How much of that sticks? And I think all of a sudden we have incentivized, trained, whatever it might be, a lot of consumers that maybe never shopped online in the past to do it. And so not only is that a changed behavior that will likely have a long-standing impact on our industry, but a lot of DIY behavior I'm going to talk about in a few slides that has maybe all of a sudden taken place, whether that's a white-collar employee that maybe was driving to an office 5 days a week, traveling somewhere a couple of times a month. All of a sudden, that time has been freed up to do the projects that they've been wanting to do on a vehicle or on a boat or on an RV, right? So all of these things tie back to some of this online growth as to what consumers are doing at home and why they're shopping online and what they're shopping for. So when we think about sentiment around in-store shopping, again, this is very current data. This is not 5 months ago, 6 months ago. This is 10 days ago we did this. We asked consumers, hey, what do you think about some of these things? Only a third of consumers told us that they think stores are doing a good job with customer safety. That same third said, look, I'm concerned because people aren't wearing masks properly. They're not social distancing properly. And only 30%, the kind of the flip side right there in the middle, said, I'm completely comfortable with in-store shopping. And this is still to this day. So there is continued opportunity for retail stores, for shop owners, anywhere where the public is walking into a location, there is continued opportunity to think differently about how you are making that customer feel comfortable. Or that customer is not even walking into your location today because in their minds they aren't comfortable. Is there a way to incent them to come back in now and in the future? Because this is a very real thing and will continue to be into the future. And so when we think about it at a very high level, what this has done to e-commerce, we estimate that at a very high level, there's been an acceleration of 3 to 5 years in terms of the shift to e-commerce. Meaning for the automotive aftermarket, a year ago, if I'd been standing on a stage in Las Vegas talking to you about what we're seeing, I would have said, look, for the DIY retail consumer, we estimate that the buyer penetration is somewhere around 17 to 18% for the aftermarket, meaning a DIY customer that's buying automotive products for their car, 17 to 18% of those consumers went online at some point in the last 12 months to buy something for their car. And so now, oh, and by the way, that was, maybe a 1 point migration each year leading up to that number last year. Well, now all of a sudden there's been, a significant acceleration, and we think that we've jumped ahead 3 to 5 years. So I'm not going to put a number on this because it's just, there's too many moving pieces. I just say, hey, it's X% now. But when this thing settles out to that phrase I said I wouldn't say, a new normal, we think it's been a 3 to 5 year acceleration. This has put retail store closures very much more into the spotlight. There's been a number of bankruptcies in the last 6 months. A lot of these are clothing retailers, but some are more general merchandise. And we expect this to continue. And that's something we were talking about a year ago, is that, hey, retail store closures were very much a thing. In fact, we anticipated that 2020, outside of COVID, would likely be one of the worst years in terms of just the number of stores closing, whether that's brands like some of the ones in front of you that go away completely, other companies that maybe close, X% of their store base. We expected that to be a story, and here we are. There were a number of retailers that were already hanging on by a thread to begin with, and all of a sudden you've got forced closures, and all of a sudden the apparel industry has seen not a pretty year, frankly, as a lot of us aren't having to buy clothing because we're not going to an office anymore and not having to dress to impress, if you will. And so that's been an issue on an industry that was already teetering along. And so here we are. We've got a number of bankruptcies that are in front of us, and will continue. So then we think about it at a very high level. I already told you about how retail's performed overall. You saw the Amazon Prime Day spike. But we start breaking down those industries, and I'm going to start kind of breaking down what we're seeing. There are a number of industries that have seen an impressive increase in demand over the last 6 months. Demand generated by people working from home, learning from home, DIY projects, cooking more at home and not going out. All of these things that have really put doing it yourself, cooking, cleaning at home, shopping at home, teaching your kids, right? All these things, working in the garage, that all of a sudden we're doing from our house. Increased demand is very much the story in those areas. We have industries that have retained most of their demand, and I put the aftermarket. And again, when I start talking about aftermarket, I know there's a broad audience on this call. Our view of what's happening at retail is just that, is what's happening with stores, what's happening with retail sales in the aftermarket. Some categories have seen crazy numbers this year in our industry, others not so much. And so I'll get into that, but categories like wash and wax, paint and body, those categories are literally through the roof, historic growth. But then some of the more traditional categories, I would argue some of the more important categories for our industry, motor oil, washer fluids, wiper blades, some of the maintenance categories aren't seeing the growth that other more discretionary categories are. I will get into that. And then you have low demand categories. You've got things like apparel that just have found themselves, in a camp of almost, I don't want to say non-existent. It's very much still existent, but challenges as it relates to demand and inventory challenges. As it's a very seasonal industry, and all of a sudden, what was in 6 months ago didn't sell. What do you do with it? That's somewhat of a challenge. So let's break it down by industry. And these are numbers year to date through July, but the story really hasn't changed. On the right-hand side, you've got the ones that are above a 100 index, or that have grown 20, 30, 50%. The cycling industry, I try to avoid telling personal stories because each of us has a fun personal story that relates to this. My son popped his tire on his bike, and I went down to the local sporting goods store just to find a tube, and they didn't have a tube, and neither did Walmart.com and Amazon.com. I mean, I couldn't find a tube for his bike anywhere. And so at the local sporting goods store, there were no bikes to be found, right? We all know this story. But in the back on the top rack, I say, hey, what's the story with that one over there? And it was a dusty one that they had kind of forgotten about. So he popped the tire and he got a new bike to replace it. That was our only choice. That was my only choice. But a lot of consumers have purchased bikes, housewares, sporting equipment, toys, office supplies, all these industries that have seen impressive growth because of what's happening at home. On the left-hand side, fashion accessories, watches, cosmetics, apparel, footwear, all categories that are down 20+% this year. And I'm going to talk to you about where some of that business has gone. Automotive, again, retail front room categories have found itself right in the middle. That 5% overall, that's through July. I'm going to talk to you about more current numbers than that. I'm going to show you a breakdown of the categories because there are some categories that have done way better than that here over the last several months. So if we step that down and we look at the top growth categories, I would encourage you to think about your own behavior at home. Personal computers. This is a 3-month number. That $2 billion, that is not how much has sold. That's the growth over 3 months a year ago. It is absolutely insane. LCD televisions, 3 months ending August, up almost $1 billion. And the list goes down. What's really neat for us at NPD is, the automotive aftermarket we don't typically have categories that pop onto a chart like this when we're talking about, consumer categories that are just very widespread, TVs and computers, et cetera. Well, we have automotive batteries right there in the middle of the chart that has seen north of $164 million in growth during that 3-month period. It's an impressive number. Some of that is likely pull forward volume. I'm a little concerned about that. As cars maybe had a battery that was on the brink of death, and that car has been sitting for a few weeks and the battery's dead. So now I'll replace it, and that's a battery that I likely would have replaced at the first cold snap in the fall. I replaced it a little sooner than that. So that's maybe some pull forward volume, but very real volume nonetheless. Then the other side of this story is recreational batteries, marine batteries. Maybe you had a vehicle in the garage that you were intending on working on as a project car, and you haven't gotten around to it the last year or 2 or 5. And now all of a sudden you've got time to work on it. First thing you do is see if we can get this thing running, we replace the battery, right? So overall, kind of a cool story to see. But look below that, golf clubs, printers, golf club sets, golf balls, right? I'm sitting here looking at you through a camera that I bought 6 months ago and a monitor I bought 6 months ago, right? Keyboard, mouse, a printer behind me that's new. And I think a lot of us have done that to get our home offices to a place where we're comfortable working from home. So a lot of cool stories as it relates to that. When you think about some of the brands that have at a high level seen growth, Apple, Samsung, HP, Callaway Golf, right? A lot of success despite all the challenges we're facing with the pandemic. A lot of really cool big name brands that have seen a lot of success over the last several months, and this specifically as a 3-month number. So let's talk about apparel spending. And when we look at what consumers were buying maybe a year ago in apparel, we can look at kind of where that money went. And a lot of these categories are ones I've already touched on, but I want to point out some themes here. Because again, I think as we think ahead about what the industry looks like, DIY is very much an opportunity for us as an industry. So we have consumables and grocery that we've seen money shift to. We're cooking from home more. Home improvement. This has been a big story. I've got a project going on in my backyard right now, right? In fact, I'm anticipating, I joked with Kelly before this, it's already happened once in the last 2 weeks, and I jokingly say that they're going to cut my internet line again, right? But they're hammering away. My dogs are barking. I expect the UPS guy to stop by. His name's Jose, by the way. We're good friends. We're on a first name basis now because I see him a lot. Good guy. But all these things that we're all dealing with, but home improvement projects very much part of the story as we all sit here and stare at that ugly wall. Hey, let's knock this wall out or improve this, right? A lot of us have adopted pets. Houston area shelters reporting several times over the last few months that their shelters have just strictly been empty. Frankly, been empty. It's because there's so many people at home and looking to adopt new pets, which I think is an awesome story. Technology improvements, cooking at home with housewares and small appliances, sporting goods, toys, automotive, right? This is, again, in an industry that we look at that is down 20+%. Where did it shift to? And it definitely shifted. And I say all of this because, again, I mentioned the DIY behavior. I think our industry has a huge opportunity to encourage and embrace the DIY behavior that has taken place both in the home and in the garage, but obviously more importantly for us, what's happening in the garage. Whether that's on the daily driver, the project car, the new dirt bike, the new ATV that I just bought in the last 6 months, I bought an RV, I bought a boat, whatever it might be. All of these things are very real behaviors that have taken place, and all of these things are good for our industry. And if you think about a year ago, we were talking about a DIY, the side of our business that was slowly but surely declining in lieu of DIFM. This is exactly what we needed. And trust me, none of us needed a pandemic in our lives, right? It's a very real thing. But something that out of left field would encourage DIY behavior, this is definitely has been something that we could have anticipated, but it has definitely helped. So talking about automotive maintenance, the question we asked, again, this is that same consumer research. Who would you say is doing more of the work on your vehicle due to COVID-19? And I point out that bottom number, 28% of those respondents said, I'm doing more of the work myself. 40% said there's no change, but a third said, look, I'm having a shop do more. But that 28% is really a fascinating number for me, because that is something that I wouldn't have expected, to see a number like that a year ago. Now we've got almost a third of folks saying, look, I'm doing more work myself, right? I've got the time, and I'll save a little money doing it myself. And so here we are, I'm doing it myself. So how does that translate into what's happened in the retail aftermarket? And so I'm going to break down kind of at a high level what we're seeing. I thought it was very fascinating. I talked to you about on that last slide, people that are doing more work themselves, but that was a number amongst people that are having work done on their cars. 13% of the population claims to have done vehicle projects or work that they've never attempted in the past. That's of the population, the U.S. population, not just a subset of people that maybe worked on their car in the last, X period. This is 13% of the population that has tackled a project, right? This is huge for our industry. And so when we think about, let's go back to a year ago, and I'm basically summarizing the topics that I talked to you about a year ago. Tariffs were very much a hot topic at AAPEX, so very much a real thing. Take a sip of my coffee. I would encourage you all to take a sip of your coffee during this. That's something I can't do at AAPEX on a stage, take a sip of coffee. Tariffs, very much a real thing. Retail store closures, very much a real thing a year ago. And as I already touched on, something that's accelerating due to COVID. We were really pushing on service being the new product. And it seems so cliche, right? But where consumers were telling us they were investing their discretionary spending dollars was with retailers and with service organizations that look at them as a consumer that has a lot of choice. How can I make the overall process of transaction with me easier? And so what that has become now, very much so now, is, look, you're concerned about coronavirus, rightfully so. What can we do to make you more comfortable so that you want to shop in our store, or at least shop with us? Maybe not come to our store, but hey, buy from us. We'll deliver it same day within 2 hours, right? Those types of changes that have taken place. Buy from us. We'll deliver it to you in your car on the curb. You don't have to come in, right? Things that are logistically easy, but very real opportunities for us as an industry. By the way, you bring your car to me for service. Look, we'll come get it. And because we know you don't want to be in our locations, we'll bring it in. We will repair it. We're going to come back, and when we drop it off in your driveway, we'll sanitize it before we depart. Things like that. Service was very much the story back then, a year ago, and it's very much the story now. We were talking about brands facing challenges from all over the place. Direct to consumer taking share, private label brands taking share, non-native brands that maybe built a strong presence online and then used that success online to get on shelf, right? That was very much a story. And private label isn't going anywhere. And it is definitely something that we're thinking about. I'm not going to talk a lot about today because frankly, it's, nothing doesn't really tie to the COVID story per se, but that's very much still a very interesting topic and one worthy of discussing. The aftermarket fundamentals back then were strong. They're stronger now, frankly. Yeah, the miles driven number is facing some challenges, but I think at a very high level, the industry fundamentals are strong. And then e-commerce, and I've already touched on that, but this is, again, a summary of what we were talking about 6 months ago, or 12 months ago, excuse me. So let's talk about the things we have to talk about, a couple of things real quick. Miles driven. I focus really on that middle bucket, the cumulative year-to-date trend. Through August, miles driven is down about 15%. The U.S. government reports these numbers. They're a little slow to report, so they have August numbers out right now. We're down 15. It's stabilizing, if you will. And if you look on the left-hand side of the individual months, the last few months, June, July, and August, all hovering in that 11 to 13% range. That is a stable trend to me. And so maybe that 15% is kind of where we bottom out. And another thing that I like to look at for this is what's happening with gasoline demand. And this isn't actually a measurement of demand. It's a measurement of the amount that was supplied in the U.S. And so on the left-hand side, well, first off, in the middle, you've got that big dip in April and going into May, down 40, 50%, which again, I just showed you miles driven. This is gasoline supplied. The two correlate very well. The cool thing about this metric, which is reported, just pop myself up on the screen, apologize if you can see me. The cool thing about this metric is it's fairly current, right? So it's through October 16th. And so you've got numbers hovering in the 8 to 10% range down. October 16th, I just put that number in the presentation this morning before coming on with you. And that big drop is a bit of a head scratcher for me. The only thing that comes to mind is the fact that it's Amazon Prime days. Would that affect miles driven? Possibly, but don't hold me to that. I don't know that I have another explanation for why the big drop. So there's probably someone out there saying it's this, and I haven't thought of it. Generally speaking, we're hovering in this average of down 10%, 8 to 10% on a week-to-week basis. Overall, year-to-date, gasoline supplied is down 13%. So if you're trying to think about where it's going to end, that 13% is probably an overall good number. It might improve some, especially as we get into the holiday season. And I'm genuinely curious to watch what happens to the miles driven story as we get into the holidays. There's a consumer base out there that is very concerned about mass transit, air travel, buses, trains. And as we want to get, into a mode of thinking about going to see family this holiday season, air travel is typically nuts that time of year. What does that mean for miles driven? And I'm going to talk about the road trips. That's very much a thing. And so we might see an improvement in that regard. The trick with this, slowly lose some control. There we go. All right. So the trick with this is that there are multiple stories within the overall miles driven number, right? So I'm telling you, look, right now, an average week is down 10%, but you can't take that at face value. There are some positive stories. There are some negative stories. For some consumers, that 7 a.m. commute is dead, right? And I'm not going to an office right now. Our company is still, home based. But every morning, not every morning, but a lot of mornings, I look at the traffic map in Houston, something that I used to do every morning before I headed into the office to see if there's a wreck I'm going to have to deal with or whatever. But the Houston map was typically just plastered in red, right? All the roads were red, very heavy traffic. And still, right now, it is green throughout the city. The commute is dead for a lot of people now and likely permanently. Yet there's a lot of consumers that are telling us, hey, I'm taking road trips, right? I'm going on camping trips. I'm doing things that I've never done before, right? So while the miles driven number, it's down, let's say 10% on an average week right now, making it worse is that commute. Making it better is people doing road trips and essential employees that are still driving to work, right? So there's multiple stories within that story. So let's talk about that road trip. And one of the questions, again, we asked about thinking ahead. Hey, what are you thinking about road trips? They've been a hot topic. Through mid-October, about a third of the consumer base told us, look, I've got no real plans for a road trip. But 14% said I'm planning more, and at the bottom, 12% say I'm planning at least one, but I don't normally do road trips. So coupled together, we're at 26 points. That is a big opportunity for us as an industry, as consumers prepare their vehicles for road trips now and into the future, especially as we get into the holiday season. And if we want to go past the holiday season, start thinking about spring break of 2021. Right? I am not a doctor. I am not an economist, and I would not touch with a 10-foot pole when I think things would get back to normal. Because when's the vaccine going to come? All of these things, right? There's a lot of uncertainty around all of that. But spring break isn't that far away. So what does that look like from a road trip standpoint? I think there's big opportunity here, not only for us to embrace those consumers that are already planning that road trip, but for the consumer that frankly hasn't even maybe thought of the idea. Right? So how do we as an industry go out there and say, look, road trips are in. Jump in the car, go to a park, a state park, a national park, go rent an RV, whatever it might be. That's a big opportunity for us. On the flip side of the story is the consumers that aren't purchasing automotive products. The question was asked, hey, are you buying automotive products right now? And of that base that told us I'm simply not, when asked why, almost a third told us I'm just not driving as much. Right? That's the tailwind. That's what's making that miles driven number worse. Almost half said, frankly, I just don't have a need right now. So that will slowly improve with time, but that is a challenge for us at a very high level. Changing the lens a little bit on the new car sales front, had a pretty significant dip in April. Things are close to what they were, but not quite yet there. Interest rates couldn't be better on this front. Incentives continue. Supply issues exist. A lot of dealerships reporting, look, I just don't have the supply, the inventory I need to be able to sell the vehicles that consumers want. But overall, look, this big dip in new car sales is a good thing for the aftermarket, as much as it's a bad thing for the country at a high level, a pandemic, obviously. For us, we've been talking about for years what happened in 08 and 09, the Great Recession and the dip in new car sales, and how that kept older cars on the road for longer. And then here we are 10 years later, and now we're saying, hey, look, it's been a little bit of a challenge for us. That we had a big dip 10 years ago in new car sales, meaning there weren't many cars sold 10 years ago. There's not as many cars in our sweet spot today, right? But that's improving, and that's something we've been saying, look, that's going to age out of our car park. Well, now we've had this big dip again, meaning there's just going to be older cars on the road for longer. Again, a nice little tailwind for us as an industry. So where is the aftermarket growth coming from? Again, we have multiple resources, multiple data assets at NPD that I have at my disposal to look at. But the aftermarket as a whole, these are numbers through June, and I try to get more current numbers than this. And as of this presentation, I wasn't able to. Look at the trend. This is the story. Don't worry about the specific number or the date, but this is the story. Aftermarket overall is at an index of 121 through June, and I do have more current numbers than that and a couple of slides for the overall number. That growth, a lot of that growth is coming from online, but a lot of it's coming from in-store too. And I would encourage you to look at in-store sitting at an index of 118, which is pretty much in line with the overall number of 121. And online sitting at an index of 200. So that, if you're thinking about the math behind that, that should tell you the weight that the online number has to the overall aftermarket number. But online sales have shot through the roof. They've literally doubled for what we track at retail, which, I'll be curious to see, does that stay? And again, I've already touched on that. But a lot of us out there think a lot of that's here to stay. But overall, both in-store and online, doing quite well. So let's talk about the actual sales performance of what we're tracking. So let me caveat this with methodology. These numbers on this chart are actual point of sale numbers from brick and mortar retailers. We have over 25,000 stores in these numbers, very large retailers, very important retailers to our industry in these numbers, including, in no particular order, Advance, AutoZone, O'Reilly, Pep Boys, and Walmart. Those are kind of the big 4 or 5, if you will. But there's 20 or so that are in these numbers. And so you can kind of see, again, what's happening with dollars, what's happening with units. These are retail front room categories only that are included in this. So we're not including hard parts, we're not including commercial sales. So you have, starting out at the year, hovering around flat. Then you have, the dip. You have a little bit of a pickup there in March as we all were looking for hand sanitizer and masks and whatever else. So we were actually in auto parts stores trying to find that, hand sanitizer, masks, etc. The big dip, stimulus hits in late April, boom, we're up and running. In late April, when these first numbers started coming in, 20% at a high level or close to it, I did not believe it, frankly. I challenged our data quality team. I pushed them hard. I said, look, I just think this doesn't seem right to me. Why would all of a sudden this industry be up 20%? But then more and more weeks started coming in. Our data quality teams would say, look, this is spot on, these numbers. And then we, not just in the aftermarket, but we quickly realized across overall retail that, whoa, like the stimulus payments, yeah, for a lot of consumers went to actually support themselves, their day-to-day living. But there was a big chunk of the consumer base that spent it on very much discretionary items, all right? So, we saw the similar bump that I mentioned earlier in June for Father's Day, a bit of a softening as we went into the summer. That little dip there in April was simply a calendar shift for the Labor Day holiday. And then here the last couple of weeks, we have seen some softening where we were trending double digits. Now we're sitting in the 4 to 6% growth range. Most recent week through 10/17, that's a week number, a 1 week number versus the same week a year ago, sitting at 4.4%. And so year to date, this view, the number is up 7. which is a rock solid number. I showed you on a couple of slides back that index, you might recall, index of 105, that was through July. Through 10/17, we're up almost 5%, 4.4% for the week. Year to date, we're up almost 7% overall. And so what we have done is really try to understand not so much sales patterns, but consumer behavior patterns as it relates to this story. And we put all of our categories into 4 buckets. Distressed purchases, right? The dead battery, I have to have it now. As needed purchases. And these are categories that frankly haven't done all that well this year. These are categories that you don't really buy them until you recognize the need for them. You're driving in the rain and you turn on your wiper blades. It hasn't rained in a while and the wiper blades are awful, so you replace them. Or you're driving and all of a sudden your AC isn't cooling properly, so you need to recharge the system. Hey, you go to spray the windshield with washer fluid, it's out, right? You top it off. Simply as needed, things you don't necessarily do on a cadence that maybe you would an oil change. There's recreation categories that have done very well, and then DIY project categories that have done very well, right? So 4 kind of consumer behaviors that we observed. And so when we break down that year-to-date number that I told you, on the left-hand side, that's that 6.9% I just told you about a few slides ago. Categories on the upper end of this chart are ones that a year ago I probably wouldn't have talked much about. They would have been maybe somewhere in the middle, but nothing that are really driving significant growth. Hand care, no surprise there. Paint and coatings, light duty shop equipment. That's like floor jacks and jack stands and creepers and diagnostic equipment. Body repair, appearance accessories, things you would use to detail a car, not the chemicals, not the wax, but the actual accessories, the bucket, the sponge, the applicator, whatever. Tape, which goes with the body repair, appearance chemicals, fluid management, spark plugs. I can keep going down the list. There are stories within the story. Spark plugs is more recreational spark plugs than it is merely automotive spark plugs, right? But that's the left-hand side of this. Discretionary, project-based, etc. On the right-hand side are categories that are more as needed, more core, if you will, to the front room categories that we track. Those being on the declining side year to date, motor oil, lighting, wipers, washer fluid, but even on the low end of positive, antifreeze, performance chemicals, filtration, right? Those are all categories that are large in size, large and important, but ones that have found themselves on the right-hand side. And so, of course, the natural question is when do those come back? This is where we get down to the miles driven story. And we talked about the miles, there's the story within the story on miles driven, and that's a challenging one to predict. But what has really been fascinating to watch is on the left-hand side, some of the discretionary categories. And so when we break down the types of purchases that are happening, we said, hey, what help me understand at a high level what was going on. Of those who have purchased something for their vehicle this year, 15% told us, it was a planned purchase for later in the year, but I bought it early. Take that for what it is. That could be the battery, the distressed purchase, but you don't really often plan a battery purchase. But maybe you were going to detail a car later in the year. Maybe you were going to work on a project car later in the year, right? And so that is something that, that's something that I'm thinking about as we look ahead, because how much of the volume we've seen sell was pull forward volume. And then 13% of these folks said, look, I had no intention of purchasing, but I did. And so then we get into some short-term considerations. And, you think about, there's so much to think about with all of this. The project car, because I had time to work on it, right? And I think that carries into the future, right? Maybe it's the mom or dad out in the garage teaching one of their kids how to work on a car as a home-based project that they've done because they had nothing else to do, right? And we're still very much in an opportunity window as an industry to encourage that type of behavior. I like to think some of that behavior maybe has encouraged younger generations, right? We've taught them something about how to work on a vehicle, and I still think there's an opportunity over these next few months especially to do that. And so, we know that driving behaviors and driving patterns have been permanently impacted by COVID. And I mean that strongly. That's a permanent change, right? Some positive, some negative, but things have changed. There are some analysts out there in the community that believe that 10% of the miles driven has simply gone away for obvious reasons, like not driving to an office anymore, as especially in the tech world. But a lot of industries are saying, look, we are putting in place permanent work from home plans for our employees. But that is one aspect of this story. There are a lot of aspects to it and a lot of positive ones to think about. So let's talk about some of the inflection points and what we think the inflection points are as we think about driving, as we think about our industry as a whole. There is back to school. And again, back to school, as I already mentioned, is a moving target. As schools open, schools shut. Colleges do virtual, colleges do in person. Colleges figure out plans for next semester, right? That is a moving target, but it very much has implications for us as an industry. Entertainment spending. The lack of entertainment spending has freed up discretionary dollars for other things. So as that slowly comes back, that will pull discretionary dollars away from other industries like the aftermarket. The urban exodus, right? And a year ago, we were talking about a big picture trend called urbanization, right? As more and more consumers moved and flocked towards cities. Now what we are seeing is those same consumers and other consumers move away from living in heavily populated areas. Whether that's because the tech company that I work for has told me, hey, you're working from home permanently, and I realized, whoa, now I don't need to pay the high rent on the West Coast that I was paying. I can literally live anywhere. I'm going to take it up. Whether that's people moving to a rural area because they're working from home. There's a lot to this story. What does back to office, back to work look like? Again, here in Houston, it's a mixed bag. Some companies are 100%. Some companies haven't gone back at all. But that's definitely an inflection point. And then where do things settle out with mass transportation? And where do things settle out with consumer comfort around mass transportation? That being obviously airline travel, that being buses, subways, etc. But one I frankly don't think a whole lot about, but I read an article about is the bus industry. An industry that has, if I recall correctly, $15 billion in annual revenue, and they're anticipating that number to be $4 billion this year. Right, they've got 80,000 or 100,000 employees in that industry, and 80,000 of those folks are not currently working. Right, it's an industry that's just been hit very hard by all of this. So does that come back? Some will, but that's a tall order to see. And so, I touched on K through 12 learning. And again, this is a moving target, but some are remote, some are hybrid, some are full in person. And so as of August, 68%, this is based on a sample of districts, 68% were saying remote learning only, right? And that definitely has an impact on miles driven. It definitely has an impact on, the bus community. It has an impact on working people that are not working right now because they had a part-time job, but now they're not because they're trying to educate their children at home, right? So that's definitely an inflection point as this gets back to some type of normal. The entertainment piece that I touched on, you think about industries that are listed in front of you, the cruise industry, gyms, sporting events, concerts, movies, and all that. These are industries that have, are facing huge challenges. This will come back with time, but this is an inflection point. And again, we can continue to encourage projects at home because discretionary spending that was being spent on things like this, hey, maybe now there's an opportunity to go out and do fun projects in the garage. I touched on the living arrangements, but let me break this down a little more. Young adults right now, more so than ever, are living with their parents. 52% of young adults are living with a parent, young adults being up to 29, I think was the definition. But that's a big difference compared to just January, which was 46%. Think about the economic sentiment of that population. We're seeing metropolitan areas departing for rural. And when you think about the markets that are seeing an increase in inflow of people, it's a lot of vacation spots, the areas with beaches, fishing, golf, and then markets with a net decline or an overall, I guess it's an increase in departures, if you will, kind of opposite way to say it, are largely college towns. Right, as college kids head back home to do virtual learning, or maybe never went back after the summer because they're staying home for learning, right? So those towns are really feeling the brunt of this thing. Unemployment, the story is it's not nearly as rosy as it was pre-pandemic, but it's improving. And one thing we've always talked about is how the number one place that folks drive to is their job 5 days a week. And so not only is it the work from home story, it's very much the unemployment story too. And as this improves, we talk about kind of an outlook ahead. We should see miles driven start to improve as well. But this is still very much a challenge, and very much a challenge for us as an industry. And then financial health. How do you in general, how do you feel right now about the overall health of your personal financial health situation compared to just a month ago? 15% of those folks, and this survey was done again mid-October, 15% said I'm better off. 63% said the same, but almost a quarter said they're worse. And again, if you think about, I've said a lot of positive things during this presentation, but a lot of folks out there are worse off right now than they were just a month ago. And so that is something that this story will continue to evolve. And so as we think ahead, that's going to be an inflection point too. The stimulus payment back in April, it was a nice little bump for us as an industry. And so there's a lot of talk of, will there be another one? When will it happen? Will it happen before the election? All those types of things, right? And so it's kind of interesting to break down how the last one was used based on income level. The right-hand side was people that saved that check, put it in the bank. On the left-hand side are people that used it for the essentials, like food and household items. But a good chunk of consumers used it for durable goods and other spending. And I would anticipate that same thing would happen again if we saw another round come through. Kind of some folks using it for essentials, but another chunk of those people using it for durable goods. That's something to watch for, especially for our industry at a high level as we go into what the holiday season looks like. And then there is back to work. I've got 3 minutes. I'm going to try to get through these next couple of slides fairly quickly. But when we look at a baseline, and this is based on really cool information, it's GPS data, which is a little scary, but it is what it is. We look at people based on GPS cell phone movement data back in February that were leaving their home for a job X number of days a week. That same pool of people, what are they doing now? And so you can see that there was a huge dip in that percentage of those people that were leaving for home back in February. And now we're sitting at roughly 46% through late September of that February 2020 base, ones that are leaving for home today. And so that is tremendous upside on the miles driven front potential as we look ahead for 2021 and beyond, as some of that comes back. I don't think it ever gets to 100%, this story, but it definitely will come back. And then some of the things I've already alluded to, travel declines, spending at home, shopping behavior, all of these things, especially the travel front, is something that I'm thinking about as we look ahead. The last thought I will leave with you before I wrap this up is what gift giving is going to look like this year. And I would encourage everyone to think about this differently. If you're on the manufacturer side, if you're on the retail side, there is still very much an opportunity to promote this. A lot of us have found new hobbies. And so instead of giving a gift of a experience, I do believe that the opportunity to give a gift of whatever that new hobby might have been, working on that old car in the garage, detailing that daily driver, there's very much an opportunity here. And I think we might see a nice lift in this regard as we go into the holiday season, gift giving around garage-based hobbies, specifically the vehicle in the garage. To wrap it up, I'm going to kind of go through this somewhat quick. There's a number of macro tailwinds, DIY tailwinds, and some headwinds, right? So from a macro perspective, talk about gasoline prices being low, an anti-viral society avoiding mass transit, the road trip, the reverse and urbanization trends, right? All of these things that are nice tailwinds for us. I just wrapped up talking about projects at home. The opportunity is better than it ever has been right now to encourage younger generations to learn how to work on a vehicle. Huge opportunity for us as an industry. Still in times of economic uncertainty, that's when people are trying to be thrifty with their money. DIY is very much part of that story. And again, some of the headwinds, what did that pull forward volume look like? That's going to be a challenge. DIY comps, I think, in 2021, based on some of the project work that we were talking about, some of the big growth numbers we've seen in 2020, I think will be a bit of a challenge as we go into 21. But then, what does unemployment benefits look like? What does the work from home culture look like? Where does it land? I don't think we ever get back to 100%, but it will continue to improve, but that's going to be a challenge as well. And so that is at a high level what we're seeing, what we have seen, and kind of what we're thinking about for 2021 and beyond. And I would, first off, thank you for attending. Thank you to the association for inviting us to come back and present this virtually this year. And I would encourage you to send questions through the chat. My email address is here on front of you, as is my mugshot. And feel free, please, to reach out with questions. And I wish all of you a great holiday season and a 2021 ahead. Take care.
Nathan, thank you so much. So on behalf of Auto Care Association and ASA, I'd like to thank Nathan and NPD for contributing to this series, and thank you all for taking the time to attend. As I mentioned earlier, this will be recorded and available online at apexshow.com later this week. And I just wanted to remind everybody that we will be hosting our virtual AAPEX experience next week, November 3rd through 5th. If you have any questions or need more details or to register, you can go to apexshow.com. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful day and remain safe and healthy. Thank you.